I think welcome to everybody. I mean, we're still waiting for one of the speakers. I don't know if you know. No. But let's get started because we're already a bit late. So I can start with the housekeeping comments. Well, hello.
I'm sorry.
No, on the contrary. No, come in, please.
Thank you.
Okay, I thought, I was looking for you. Okay, so we can get started. So let me start with just one brief housekeeping comment, which has to do with the language regime. First of all, thank you very much for our interpreters for being here and doing such an excellent job. So participants can speak and listen to the following languages. French, apart from English, obviously, French, German, Czech, Lithuanian and Slovenian. So you can express yourself in those languages, and we encourage you to do so, of course. So we're starting a bit late, so let's get into business straight away. One of the key features and topics that has been discussed yesterday in the course of the afternoon and has been brought up again this morning was the fact that the EU is confronted with new needs, new priorities, which will need to have some funding reflection in the EU budget. Security and defence is at the heart of all the discussions, as underlined by the EU global strategy, subscribed by all the member states. We are discussing on a daily basis the new challenges that we have from a geopolitical point of view in our neighbourhood, also inside our borders. And in order to have a deeper discussion of this area of policy action, I would like to introduce an excellent panel of speakers. First of all, Camille, who is the Assistant Secretary General for Defence Investment in Nato. He has a long experience in the defence sector, and before his current role, he was previously Director and CEO of the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique. We also have Max Elger, the Secretary of State of the Ministry of Finance of Sweden. So sorry because I didn't put it here. Mr. Max Elger, the Secretary of State, then Fabrice Leggeri, the Executive Director of Frontex, and Robin Wainwright, Executive Director of Europol. And I was asking, of course, Mr. Strombimski, because he was added to the program later, and I didn't want to make a mistake to present him as the Minister of Finance of the Czech Republic. Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic. So without further ado, we will give 5 minutes to each of the participants to do an introductory remark. And then afterwards, we will open the floor straight away for questions from your side. I suggest that we just follow the order of the names which appear in the program. So that would be starting with Mr. Camille Grand. In the wrong place.
It's okay. Come on.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for this invitation and for this opportunity to speak to this group. It's the second time the EPSC has invited me to speak in these debates on the MFF, and I'm really I feel very privileged to be part of these discussions. I must say it's quite extraordinary to sit in an MFF discussion with a focus on defense. And if you look even 5 years back, the notion that we would be discussing defense and security as one of the priorities for the next budget cycle is quite interesting. Secondly, and this is all the more important seen from the other side of town, the notion that you invite NATO to be part of that discussion is also, I think, quite telling and interesting. Obviously, this is part of a broader policy development, and I don't have to go into these in details, but President Juncker highlighted the need for a full-fledged European Defence Union by 2025, so it has become a major policy for the European Union, and he did stress that the EU needed a budget that matched its ambition in security and prosperity, and to meet those future challenges, including those that are related to security and defense. Obviously, this is not only a political decision by the President of the Commission or the current Commission or the Member States. This goes beyond that. It has to do with the very volatile security environment we are all confronted with. So that decision doesn't come in a vacuum, and we are in a very and highly unpredictable security environment that makes our efforts in the field of security and defense more important than ever. We are faced with a series of, in many ways, unprecedented threats from state and non-state actors, from terrorism and hybrid warfare to cyber threats. And in this context, there are not that many options as far as defense and security are concerned. To meet this ambition, the Europeans need to start spending now and to beef up defense spending. This is something that we've decided in the Nato context at the Wales summit in 2014 with this objective of spending 2% of our GDP on defense. And by the way, this is actually happening. Last year, only non-US NATO allies increased defense spending by about 5%, and this trend is continuing this year. And this is something that is quite meaningful. Of course, it was probably normal to reduce defense spending in times when tensions were going down. We need to be able to increase defense when tensions and threats are going up, as they are now. Having said all of this, there is also an interest in investing in defense, which is my particular line of work, because we need to think about the added value of investing in that particular field. And I think this is what is one of the interesting things in the steps that the Commission has taken. First of all, because the capabilities that we lose through not enough investment will not come back to life in a single day when we need them. We have to invest now, not in 10 years' time. Second, that it takes a long time to develop the right set of capabilities and the right set of technologies. Our experience in NATO shows that it takes an average of 16 years to field a capability, a high-tech capability. And it's also an investment in highly skilled personnel in Europe at a time when the mid-skilled jobs are threatened by automation. When we discuss this with industry, there is also a point on the need to keep a form of brain drain from the security and defense sector by this investment and keeping our industry at pace with the latest development. Of course, when it comes to defense, the priority lies with nations. And even if the Commission gets the support of the European Parliament, of the member states for its level of ambition in the field of defense, its new level of ambition, this will only account for about 1% of what Europeans spend on defense. So the issue here is indeed very much that of added value of that 1% and how to make the best use of that limited amount of money that is put in there. By the way, this is very similar to the amount of money that I manage at NATO in a common funded project, which roughly accounts for 1% of or a little less than 1% of the defense spending of NATO allies. So what we need to do there, and we are in a very similar situation, is to build up the force multipliers for tomorrow. And this is very much about added value again. So finding in the financial toolbox and from the experience and lessons learned by member states to support and speed up decision-making on multinational capability delivery, to engage with the European Defence Fund. And from that perspective, just a few words on that fund seen from NATO. We do see it as a potential game changer for defense research and capability development in Europe, because it will help to develop new military capabilities, to improve cooperation and to reduce duplication. So there is indeed a great deal the EU can do to coordinate the efforts of the member states. At the moment, too many resources are wasted through duplications and lack of coordination. The EDF could also reinforce the industrial base of the European nation through stimulating cooperation. By stimulating nations to engage in cooperative programs, that will lead to industrial cooperation that could in turn reduce the current fragmentation. Reducing the fragmentation of the offer is hard, but reducing the fragmentation of the demand will also lead to the consolidation of the European defense technological and industrial base. Of course, this comes in parallel with the PESCO project, the Structured Cooperation, launched at the end of last year, which is another welcome initiative in the EU. At NATO, what we did decide, and this is a very political decision, to very much welcome this development on the EU side, because we do believe that a stronger European defense is good for Europe, but it's also good for NATO. It brings more spending, more defense capability, and a fair burden sharing of the transatlantic burden, and so altogether a stronger alliance, which is good for all of our security. So from that perspective, it is indeed a win-win for the EU, for NATO, and for the transatlantic relationship. But let me wrap up with a few points that are, I think, that we need to keep in mind. The force and capabilities that will be generated through the EU initiatives should also be available for NATO commitments, because we can't afford two sets of forces. The second thing is that we need to preserve as much as possible the coherence of NATO and EU efforts on capability development. We can't have the luxury for nations to be presented with conflicting requirements and priorities. Doing things differently would be a waste of scarce resources. From that perspective, I hope NATO brings some value to the conversation. We have good ideas and experience on how to invest in defense, and to provide with some guidance on where the priorities could lie. We have a tradition of doing defense planning together, and of course 22 NATO allies are also EU member states. We also have a focus on using our own agencies specialized in meeting the demands of the need of NATO customers in communication, information, support, and procurement. And of course, a very strong focus on interoperability, which is a core requirement in the field of defense. So I think we can do more in working together on capability development, go beyond what we currently do with the European Defence Agency, and to make sure that the additional money the European Commission is ready to put on the table is spent in the best possible way, and to operate from that perspective. We have a joint NATO-EU declaration with 70 proposals that give a hint of a number of fields that are priority fields, and this is, I think, a very, very interesting and period for that. In conclusion, I think this is an opportunity for the Commission to go into the field. I think what has been drafted so far offers a very smart way into this, which is that this, of course, the opportunity of the MFF should not be missed, because investing in defense in the is a short-term commitment for long-term benefits. And there I can already see many synergies where some of our priorities can be benefit from the EU developing capabilities that will enhance our overall capability to address the security challenges of today. So with this, I'll end those opening comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that excellent introduction to the subject, and also for giving us some more details and elements of realism, some of them quite sobering. I mean, your reference to the average of 16 years has been, puts us in the right perspective when we're discussing matters related to the development of capabilities. I also appreciate very much your reference to the stronger alliance between the NATO and the European Union, not the Commission, the European Union, because this area of defense is particularly one where the member states, as you said, have a very strong, if not until now, almost the only role to play. So it's an area where the European Union, in all its forms, needs to be involved. And I also would like to refer, before I give the floor to the other participants in the panel. It's interesting what you were talking about, the efficiency gains of spending together. It was mentioned yesterday by President Juncker, who even quantified them, but also Minister Gabriel from Germany was trying to highlight how much more efficient it would be to contribute to that than just increasing up to the 3% target set by Nato on an isolated manner by the 28 member states currently in the EU. So without further ado, we turn to the speakers, starting with Mr. Stropnicki. The floor is yours.
Yeah, it functions. Thank you very much, Madam Director General, and ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank for the opportunity to address this audience on one of the most crucial topics of today. As you probably know, the Czech Republic has a new government since December last year. And I would like to assure you that we are taking the future of the EU finances very seriously, and we want to be a constructive and rational partner in the discussions. Let me start with a couple of general remarks. The MFF is a clear manifestation of the unity of the EU and of our ability to find political consensus on financing common priorities. The outcome of the upcoming discussions on the next MFF will shape our policies and our cooperation for the next 7 years and even beyond. The new MFF will also significantly influence how the EU will be perceived by the European citizens as well as by our international partners. This is why we need to come out from the negotiations more unified and more efficient. One of the main challenges will be how to effectively balance the founding of the traditional policies and new priorities. I see three main strains on the EU budget. First, we need to strengthen the founding of new EU priorities, such as migration, internal and external security and defense. Second, we need to maintain strong founding for traditional EU policies and programs, such as cohesion policy, the common agricultural policy, Horizon 2020, Erasmus, Galileo, and so on, to continue supporting convergence and competitiveness and spur the modernization of our economies. And third, we also need to cope with the UK leaving the EU. As to the structure of the MFF, lessons learned from the current one are that we urgently need to redesign the EU budget. We must be simpler, without duplications, more flexible and more effective. Also, it has to respond to unforeseeable events. Therefore, a crisis mechanism should be considered for the next MFF. It could take the form of unallocated reserve in a standby mode, which would be put aside within the relevant programs. And this leads me to the main topics of my intervention, which means security and defense. The EU represents the cornerstone of our security and prosperity. Our new government has clearly stressed that it is the key foreign policy, or its key foreign policy priority, to make sure that the EU is a safe and secure place for its citizens. Sounds simple, but it's not that simple at all. But the EU cannot be safe and secure unless our neighborhood is safe. Therefore, contributing to peace, stability, human rights, and decent living conditions, in one word, to resilience in our southern and eastern neighborhood, is in our common interest. We need to make sure that these priorities will be supported by sufficient funding on the EU level. The EU security also depends on the resilience of our own societies. This is why we need to improve the EU strategic communication abroad and towards our own citizens. Sound and reliable information is a precondition for countering disinformation campaigns, which are massive, which pose security threats, and a risk to destabilize our European democracies. Therefore, we need to make sure that the EU Stratcom, namely Stratcom East, is adequately financed for the future. We also need to sustain our support to independent media in our neighborhoods. As to the current migration crisis, we support the increase of funding for the migration and asylum policy in the next MFF. It is also one of the preconditions for securing the EU's external borders. And I will send a strong signal, it will send a strong signal of solidarity towards the countries of origin and transit of the migrants. In our view, it is crucial to create in the next MFF a predictable and stable EU financial mechanism for funding effective and targeted migration measures. It would help to guarantee a comprehensive EU migration system and to move away from ad hoc provisional solutions. And now allow me a few words on the external dimension of migration. We are convinced that financing of targeted activities and measures in the countries of origin, first displacement and transit, are more efficient and more cost-effective than tackling the consequences of uncontrolled illegal migration. Specifically, we should support building of capacities on the third countries and stabilization and improvement of the situation of the people in need closest to their first place of refuge. EU military missions must also help enhance the capacities of local forces combating illegal migration and smuggling networks. The second pillar of our migration policy, its internal dimension, is equally important. Here, the next MFF should increase its funding for building of effective migration management and external border control system that would provide a stronger support to the frontline member states. And now let me move on the future financing of defense, which I followed closely in my previous capacity as Minister of Defense. One of the key challenges is to find a workable and robust model for funding capacity building in support of security and development in partner countries. This is a core element of the EU's engagement. It is essential in preventing state destabilization and proliferation of violent conflict in our neighborhood. It is equally vital for post-conflict stabilization and reconstruction. Such capacity building efforts involve different sources of funding: the Athena mechanism for military operations, the instrument contributing to stability and peace, and the African Peace Facility. A variety of operational tools are involved, including civilian missions and military operations under the CSDP. However, the existing legal framework does not allow the EU to use common budget resources to provide equipment and sometimes even infrastructure for military actors in partner countries. In our view, the EU should provide CBSD with a dedicated instrument, including for military purposes. How it will be structured and whether it will be fully or partly funded from the common budget, it's part of our debate on squaring the circle. Let me also share a thought on the founding of EU missions and operations. A more ambitious approach to missions and operations requires greater solidarity. That is why we support the comprehensive revision of the Athena mechanism, including the financing scheme for EU battle groups. In the context of the future MFF, we need to look for more ambitious and integrated structures along the main axis of our CSDP action. One of the options is to establish an EU Peace and Security Trust Fund outside the EU budget, open for contributions by third parties, first and foremost the UK. Creating such a fund, however, should not come at the expense of funding the civilian conflict prevention and peace building from the MFF. And finally, let me recall that what I said at the very beginning. I understand the MFF as a manifestation of the unity of the EU. It's a crucial point. The MFF should reflect our ability to achieve political consensus on financing our common priorities. And the Czech Republic is ready to constructively contribute to the best conceivable outcome. I am positive that we will be able to prepare an MFF that will make our union stronger and more efficient in facing up to all the challenges, old and new. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister. I personally am particularly grateful for the renewal of the commitment of the new government to the very constructive approach of the Czech Republic in all the budgetary negotiations, which we suffer on a yearly basis and on a multi-annual basis. So I welcome very much that. And it's been extremely interesting also to hear your specific and concrete proposals. And overall, the fact that you signal the multi-dimensional nature of defense inside our borders, on our borders, outside, and through missions, through traditional capability developments, but also through information, independent media. I was also happy to hear Mr. Grand saying that brains are also part of our capabilities, the ones that we need to preserve. Well, now I turn to the second representative of an important member state in this context, Mr. Max Elger.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow panelists, dear Nadia, I'm grateful for the invitation and look forward to this opportunity to discuss the coming multi-annual financial framework. As a budget state secretary, I will put more emphasis on the main title for the session, a sufficient budget for new priorities, and less on security and defense, where I sadly have less experience and expertise. So, let me begin by outlining Sweden's 5 priorities for the next MFF. My government is fully convinced that a modern Europe needs a modern budget. What we need is a fundamentally reformed EU budget that will help us tackle our common challenges at the right level and with the appropriate tools. The core problem before us and the main challenge in the next MFF is the sizable loss of funding following Brexit. Therefore, first, our view is that as the UK's contribution is phased out and ends, EU expenditure will have to be reduced by the corresponding amount. We want to set an overall expenditure ceiling for the next MFF that does not exceed 1% of EU's GNI. This would be in line with the current and previous frameworks and hence sufficient. In the shaping of a more modern expenditure structure, we will have to make reprioritizations that benefit common measures addressing common challenges and generate European added value. Second, within this restrictive expenditure ceiling, it will be crucial that common funding delivers cross-border public goods and synergies, that economies of scale are exploited, and that money is spent on effective and efficient policies. Measures that correspond to these requirements can be found in the areas of migration and security, competitiveness, research, and climate change. As a consequence, expenditure that are associated with less European added value, such as agricultural support and structural funds, need to be reduced significantly. Third, contributions from member states to the EU budget should be stabilized at present levels. The financing system should always follow the fundamental principle of fair burden sharing. Fourth, not taking responsibility for common decisions and not respecting common values should come at a price. Conditionality should be given more importance in the next MFF, and member states that do not take responsibility should not receive EU funds in the same way as is the case today. This could be done through various mechanisms and measures where the Commission is the competent actor to put forward a proposal that is transparent, predictable, and that ensures non-discrimination. Fifth, a smaller EU means a smaller budget. And with a smaller budget, we must spend the money better, smaller and more efficient. The ongoing review of EU expenditure must address current shortcomings with an aim to remove, reform and replace budget lines and measures which are no longer relevant or effective, and provide a catalogue for reforms to be considered at political level. The exercise should be an open-ended discussion respecting our new financial constraints. Bottom line. We don't see a lack of resources in the current EU budget, and we are confident that a budget of a corresponding size, as compared to the future EU economy, is sufficient to cater for any new priorities. The challenge is, as in all budgetary exercises, to identify both positive and negative priorities. When we discuss, like we do today, what we want to do more, we also need to discuss what we want to do less. We have to make ends meet. Now, for the new priorities and today's topic. The cooperation between the member states in the area of security and defense is increasing, but it yet needs to be defined in what way the EU budget should play a role. Increased cooperation in the area of defense mostly concerns coordinating research and development and acquisition, and not so much common financing. Hence, I am doubtful whether or not the EU budget is the only or most appropriate tool to achieve value added for our citizens. Both military and civilian defense initiatives can be handled efficiently in cooperation between member states. If the ambition is to open up the possibilities of common debt financing, the Swedish view is that it's not feasible or possible. It's very important to protect the EU budget against substantial long-term risk. Any future initiatives on financing of acquisitions should be met by corresponding cuts in other areas. To sum up, I've argued the following. In budgetary terms, the general question of more new priorities must be addressed in the context of fiscal feasibility and consequently go hand in hand with less old priorities. This is, in fact, the essence of the word priority. The loss of funding following Brexit is the core problem before us and will be the main challenge in the next MFF. It is not physically nor politically feasible to allow Brexit to bring substantial increases in the member states' EU contributions. Contributions should be stabilized. Our vision of change in the EU budget covers much less focus on redistribution through agriculture and cohesion policies and more focus on measures with a common value added, aiming at solving common problems, such as the topics we are discussing today. Last, expenditure over the EU budget is in a number of areas not the only and maybe not the most desirable policy choice to address a common challenge. There are often viable, efficient alternatives. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, dear Max. I think that the two first speakers in our panel have very well illustrated, and that was my expectation, what the challenge will be of negotiating the next multi-annual financial framework, because how do we fund new priorities? How do we keep, as the Deputy Prime Minister said, the sufficient funding for the traditional priorities, let's call them that way, without increasing the contributions from the member states, no? And that makes this conference, I think, extremely timely, so that everybody is aware of the challenge that we're confronted with when preparing the Commission's proposal. It also makes this discussion extremely fascinating and stimulating from an intellectual point of view also. Now, turning to the two final speakers, which will provide us, I think, a more down-to-earth or practical approach to the matter. Let's listen first to Mr. Fabrice Leggeri.
Thank you very much, Madam Director General, for the invitation. Ladies and gentlemen, dear panelists, I'm very glad to share here with you the perspective of the European Border and Coast Guard Agency. In the next MFF, from my perspective, security should be one of the new priorities of the European Union. This is not recent in the national policies, but at EU level, this is relatively recent. And I would like to focus on the home affairs policies. They have established goals in the field of security, internal security and migration management. And if we want this to be concretely achieved, if we don't want just to have nice declarations and empty words, we need at EU level the necessary resources for that. So from my perspective, the allocation of funds supporting EU home affairs policies in the post-2020 MFF should therefore be consistent with this new political reality. And the new political reality is that we are facing security challenges and that our external borders have to face huge migratory and security challenges. Let me remind you of the fact that in 2013, when the current MFF was adopted, only 1.3% of the EU budget was planned for direct support to home affairs policies. This share definitely has to be increased. We see, and this is a consequence of the Schengen area, and we see more integration. We could see the benefits for states and citizens of this Schengen free movement area and this integration. But the crisis we faced in 2015 also highlighted the downside of this in terms of interdependencies and risk contagion. We had in 2015 this migration, so-called migration crisis, and we could see that if deficiency at the external borders of one Schengen partner happens, then we see the effect that can be propagated to all member states. To other member states can create distrust and mistrust in terms of security. And then we see that member states reintroduce checks at their internal borders. And we see that this is not an optimal situation on the long term. So we need, therefore, from my perspective, a robust chapter under the new MFF dedicated to Schengen and EU external borders management. And a significant amount of funds should be implemented by member states' national administrations, by the European Commission, and by Frontex, the European Border and Coast Guard Agency. I see here two main objectives. First and mainly to improve and make more resilient our border management systems. We have different systems such as the Schengen evaluation, we have the vulnerability assessment carried out by Frontex, and we will have soon the future European integrated border management strategy. So member states' national administrations need also money in order to beef up and enhance our common border management systems. The second objective I would see here is some kind of safety net that could be used as a kind of stabilization mechanism, preventing crisis from propagating from one member state to another one, and then preventing crisis from creating or putting at stake the EU as a whole, or the Schengen free movement area. But now I also would like to say that I'm not pleading only for a bigger share of the EU budget devoted to the protection of the EU external borders and security. I also would like to advocate better spending and maximizing the use and impact of the funds. Here, I think it's important to have in mind four components, four elements. First, the EU budget is implemented by member states, by the Commission, and by European Union agencies. So we have definitely to enhance consultation and coordination among all these actors, so member states, Commission, and agencies, when programming and executing the budget. So that means, in concrete terms, we have to ensure that the financial solidarity provided by the Commission complement the operational solidarity provided by Frontex and provided by other EU agencies in the field of home affairs. Second, we see that Frontex, as well as other home affairs agencies, are the EU operational executive branches in home affairs areas, and they have been tasked with more and more missions. We see that this requires extra financial resources. So there should be a mechanism making it possible to add or to give additional funds to the European Union agencies, but we also have to avoid some kind of administrative burden on the agencies when managing and executing the budget, because EU agencies are part of the EU family. We are EU bodies. Third, we have to realize that border management is also part of bigger European policies. And so we have to identify synergies with other financial instruments and EU operational actors in the field of internal security, in the field of migration management, in the field of coast guarding activities, or external action. And here I can just say that Europol, and my colleague is here in the room, is a partner in this area, but I could also highlight that we have developed and identified synergies with other agencies in the maritime activities, such as the European Maritime Safety Agency, European Fisheries Control Agencies, just as an example. The fourth element is that the European Border and Coast Guard was created in October 2016 as the sum of the competent national authorities and the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, which means that we should and we will have to implement a common integrated border management. We have, and this is enshrined in EU law, we have a shared responsibility of the member states and the agency. And therefore, this should guarantee that when we program and execute the budget, that we have one common European external border, that we have one European Border and Coast Guard in charge of the protection of the border, and one European integrated border management. Let me outline some concrete priorities that I could foresee at this point of time. First, promoting information and intelligence-led border management systems. I have in mind, for instance, the European Border Surveillance System. Second, we will have to design operations at the external borders, able to cover the whole range of border and internal security threats. Here, again, we need cooperation and synergies with other law enforcement agencies at national and EU level. We have to probably develop a more comprehensive border control approach that doesn't start at the border itself, but starts well before the traveler arrives at the EU external border. So here I'm referring to advanced passenger information, traveler authorization, visa data, and also deployment of networks of liaison officers in non-EU countries. Fourth, gradual development of EU border and Coast Guard identity with common recruitment and training standards. So this is also a way to ensure consistency, to ensure the appropriate level of efficiency at our common external border. And this would also make it possible for the agency to have well-trained pools and reaction pools in case of emergencies. Fifth, I would advocate for a European program for joint development and acquisition of border management equipment for the member states and the agency. This is possible according to the new mandate of the agency. We would here gain economies of scale, standardization, or at least the objective should be interoperability of our equipment for border management. Here I can see some possible synergies with CSDP missions. We're going to test, we have a pilot soon on trucks. And last priority will be to transform and modernize national border management systems through innovation and the use of new technologies. So let me conclude shortly about specific needs of Frontex, the European Border and Coast Guard Agency. First of all, I'm grateful for the enlarged mandate and exponential growth right now of our staff and funding. But we all know that the creation of a European Border and Coast Guard is an open-ended process. So this is not the end of the story. We can already foresee new tasks, ETIAS, proposed by the Commission. So this is the electronic pre-travel authorization to be granted to non-EU citizens who are not subject to visa requirement. We can see that the review of the Eurosur regulation may end up with new tasks for the agency. And we should have, as I said, some margin of maneuver in case agencies and Frontex get a new task during the next MFF. And maybe also let me highlight that in order to have a future-proof budget, we also have to foresee that since the agency is growing, we need a new seat. We will have a new seat in Warsaw. And this is also an opportunity to plan the future. And this is also an opportunity to politically demonstrate how important is European Border and Coast Guard in order to ensure common security and common area of free movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You have touched upon some of the issues that have already been brought up, but I would highlight one interesting one, which is the balance, the right balance between action at the European level and action at the national level, because member states still, have a key role to play. Border management is obviously a shared responsibility and will continue to be so. And also it was interesting, your reflection that external border management is not limited to the action at the border. No, it needs to be integrated with many other elements. Now we move to the second key and growing and exponentially growing, you signaled, agency, Europol. Mr. Wainwright, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nadia. Yes, and I will echo some of the points of previous speakers. But also some others as well. So, yes, indeed, Europol is one of those, like Frontex, that is given the mandate of being at the front line, really, of implementing EU policy on strategy. We do that at some scale. We are interconnecting 1,200 law enforcement agencies around Europe and in many other participating countries, using that as a very large means to collect information about terrorists and other threats, cyber threats, and using the collection of that data, the analysis of it, to identify opportunities for the national authorities to mount interdiction operations in 50,000 cases a year. So this is a large-scale enterprise now, and it's part of the EU's response to where we began with what Camille said is a very volatile security threat in Europe now, very dynamic, changing quickly. We are living right now through a period in which it's the highest terrorist threat that Europe has seen, at least for 20 years. 25 terrorist attacks alone last year. I'm afraid we can expect more this year. More professional organized crime syndicates, including those that have really taken advantage of the migration crisis as a way of professionalizing the business, multi-billion euro business of people smuggling. And cybercrime, which in a way is the most challenging of all aspects of our internal security because of how dynamic it is in its evolution and the impact that it's having. Now, what that means is the threat is large scale. It's been responded to, of course, at the EU level by the new EU strategy, by this commitment we heard from President Juncker today that we need to properly fund it. We need to make sure there's adequate funding for this, but also on a flexible basis. That's the point. We've lived through the period since 2015 where security has shot right up the charts of political priorities, and we've had to react as a community very quickly. 2015 was a seismic year in security terms. You already heard from Fabrice about the impact of the migration crisis, how it transformed our TV sets and our livelihoods that year. Now, that year also began and ended with terrible terrorist attacks in Paris. So it opened a period in which since then we've been really fighting and running very hard to try and respond. We've had to do it on a very flexible basis. That's put a big burden on agencies such as Europol, but we're still, although we're one of the largest, we're small enough to be quite nimble and agile to accommodate that growth to a certain extent. We are around 1,000 colleagues, including member states representatives in our headquarters in The Hague. But since that period, we've had to implement a new European counterterrorism centre, similar centre for migration smuggling, a unit dedicated to monitoring and helping to remove terrorist propaganda online, and so on. So a lot of new tasks that fell on the shoulders of Europol in that time. We worked very hard to improve the efficiency of administration, so the implementation rate consistently of the budget has been very close to 100%, well over 99%. And this year we will be reporting, I'm pleased to say, a 0% vacancy rate for the third year in a row, despite the increases in staff that we've received. So it is possible, I think, we're not the only agency that has a good record like this, it is possible to have a more efficient, nimble administrative architecture to accommodate this. We have benefited to a certain extent by the flexibility that's found in the current financial framework in order to help to respond to these new security threats. But of course, as we are talking here today, the financial framework can still be improved further. And I just want to offer a few reflections based on our experience of some of the problems that we've had. Now, I do that whilst recognizing the very challenging task that Nadia and others have in managing the execution at a very high level of the budgetary process, in ensuring consistency of application, for example. But nonetheless, there is other sides that we see out in the field, as it were. A slightly oversimplified, I think, sometimes one-dimensional view that all agencies are the same. All agencies have to have a 5% cut. When, of course, it's not true that all agencies are faced with the same strategic priorities and changes to that. So whereas consistency is important, I think also an understanding that across a body of 32 agencies, you can't really treat all of them in the same way. The definition of new tasks as a precondition with which to provide the basis for a new budget sometimes is a fixed definition, arbitrary in some cases, leads to a slightly dogmatic view of if it's not this, then you absolutely won't have that. Whereas in our view, although countering terrorism and cybercrime is not a new task as such, an enormous increase in the amount of operations we've had to support over this period since security has been transformed in Europe, and yet a significant increase in everyday tasks does not necessarily meet that condition. So we need to grow with that. And sometimes a slightly unbalanced investments in growth. So from the budgetary authority, mainly at the political level, an understanding that to fight terrorism we need to invest more, but we need to invest more, and all of it in operational terms. That makes sense, of course, but when you keep adding to your operational capability, keep, in our case, recruiting more and more police officers to do more and more investigative work, and you allow for no consequential increase in the administrative or IT support for that, it leads to an unbalanced administrative burden on the organization. So it's short-sighted because each year is the same. We will give you more, but it's all got to go to operations because that's the priority. And after 3 years of the same, you have no people left anymore to accommodate. Sometimes literally in our case, we're running out of space in our new building. We're having to move to others, and yet we failed to convince the budgetary authority to help us to fund that. So a slightly longer term strategic perspective about the multiple impacts of all of this. So what that means, yes, we need to more adequately fund security. Still, don't forget the point Camille and others have made, it's still a tiny share of the EU budget, despite the fact for citizens it is a top concern. So there is still this disconnect, but clearly President Juncker and others have recognized that. I agree with Fabrice that one way of doing that is to properly invest in some of the executive agencies that are responsible for delivering this, but I would say that, wouldn't I? And so would he. I want to make one last point, which is around also ensuring that we have a modern and innovative capability to respond to this. So in terms of investing in technology, especially our ability to deal better with information sharing, excellent initiative led by the Commission around interoperability. We need to make sure that is properly funded in the future. We have seen at Europol our ability to help the member states respond to these threats has come almost exclusively from our capability to use technology, to collect data at scale and use data almost like an Amazon or a Google. It really does power the way we can respond. And yet we're only going to stay ahead of the security threats if we can truly innovate and establish the research and technology basis by which to do that. I think this is a really important element. Thank you, Nadia.
Thank you very much, Bob. Also, thank you for showing to all the member states, which at the end of the year are disciplining us and calling on us to show that we have spent the money efficiently, showing them that we do impose that discipline also on the agencies, even those where there is a unanimous support for the increases of funding and staffing. We need to ensure that we don't end the year with high vacancy rates and non-spent funds. So that, you know, the call for more funds is clearly noted, but also the call for an efficient management, a good spending, better spending, as you said also. Very interesting, the reference by both of the agencies, I think, to interoperability and the joint procurement and the potential which is there for that in that area. Now, we have eaten up the time which was foreseen for this panel, but I see that the next one should start at 11. So I would suggest that we open the floor for a couple of questions so that there is a bit of interaction with the audience, and then maybe you know, we do a 5-minute technical break between these and the next panel. So I would be grateful if you could introduce yourselves when you pose questions, and so that we know. Mr. Lamassoure, peut-être vous êtes celui qui n'a pas besoin de...
Well, you're somebody who doesn't need to introduce himself, but do please go ahead.
Oui, Madame le Directeur.
Yes, Director General, thank you. Well, French is a working language, isn't it? Yes, of course. Thank you. Alain Lamassoure, Member of the European Parliament, former Chairman of the Budget Commission and Minister in France. As the Swedish Minister said in particular, and as you've recalled, our budgetary resources are limited. And I think there is a broad consensus to say that we should do more at European level, but without increasing the overall budgetary burden and without increasing the taxes paid by our taxpayers. Now, there are two ways of achieving that. Firstly, and this is the only one we've been looking at since yesterday, means that we say there are new priorities, they must be funded, and that must be to the detriment of the old priorities, will remain within the community budget. Now, if we stick with that approach, we won't get very far. Then there's a second way to achieve this, which is a lot more attractive. It's much more important. This means political progress, which must be accomplished now, and we in our member states must adopt a stance on this to see which member states are prepared to achieve this progress. We need to finance European expenditure from national economies, national savings. Now, there is a problem which arises in particular for the two agencies represented here, and could I commend the remarkable work done by those two agencies and by their remarkable directors. I think the major question which arises is whether additional staff, and this has already been decided for Frontex in particular, and I hope that that will be increased even further in the coming years, and ditto for Europol. These would add an additional layer, as it were, of officials. And so there will be additional expenditure at union level and additional taxation at the union level, and an administrative layer, which will mean that possibly the security system of the union will be made more complicated, or we could take advantage of the pooling effect and we could have public procurement so that we can achieve economies of scale, so that in accordance with the principle of subsidiarity, what is done at the union level may be more efficient than what is done at national level, and even in some cases it would make it possible for a lower cost to the budget and lower levels of taxation for European taxpayers to achieve a greater efficiency. So if we go along with this principle, every time more responsibilities are given to European agencies, we should give them staff resources, and in addition, the budgetary expenditure and means of funding should be transferred from the national level to the European level. That is the only effective way of doing things. It's the only way that we can bring national public opinion with us. But, of course, there will be very strong reactions from national administrations. They will undoubtedly fight tooth and nail to safeguard their jobs and to make sure that part of their resources will not be transferred to the European Union. And I'd be interested to hear what the panelists think of this analysis. Thank you.
Monsieur Lamassoure.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lamassoure. Anybody else?
Yes, thank you very much, Nadia. And just to follow up, Claus Sørensen, old Director General in the Commission, now working as a guru over there in the Danish Permarap. I remember in the old days when we had the enlargement of the EU, notably with Poland, I said to the Beamten, the functionaries of the German Ministry of Interior, now you can actually dispose of the Bundesgrenzschutz because you don't have any border towards the east anymore. So you will make a huge saving, and you could use some of these resources to strengthen a European border control institution. Of course, they were screaming, so I think Alain Lamassoure has absolutely right that a lot of resistance will come from the national administrations, but it's not economically rational. So my first question to you, Nadia, was actually, are we good enough at explaining not only the value added, but also the reduction of costs to our member states every time we say, let's do something in common? Are we good enough? Sometimes I feel it's missing, but perhaps you could explain that. Secondly, to Minister Stropnitzky, and I was very, very happy to hear your commitment to the European cause, because we have had a few question marks recently, but I think what you said was really very comforting. You mentioned this notion of creating a trust fund outside of the budget. At the same time, if I understood you correctly, you make a big point of maintaining flexibility in the budget, and you also made a strong case for a holistic approach to addressing our security threats in the neighborhood. Defense, development, all of that goes together. So I was just wondering how you see that something outside of the budget would maintain or improve that flexibility, because I would have thought that if we have a holistic approach, we have to use more or less the same mechanisms. I do take your point with the UK. We will have to find a way to put their money somewhere. I think that's part of a different discussion, but we have assigned revenues, etc. But Minister, maybe you could explain that. Thank you.
In view of the fact that the Deputy Prime Minister needs to leave, I think I will give the floor now to you and to the other members of the panel if they want to react to the two questions. Go ahead, thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour la parole.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I will answer in French and then switch to English. So bear with me, please. I rarely speak French. Of course, we're just at the start here, and I admit that we have a lot of suggestions, ideas, divergent ideas, and I understand very well your stance and your position. However, we can't draw conclusions at this stage. I think we have a year's time to reach consensus. But in short, I cannot imagine a European government which doesn't see European citizens' security and safety as an absolute priority. I can't see that happening. If you look around, in almost every single country, political parties are operating using an agenda of fear, using fear as a very strong, emotive message. And unfortunately, that works very well. So we have to tackle this issue of security as a priority.
is concerned, I will not go into detail, but I just wanted to point out that the system is a bit slow, unflexible, and that the time of response sometimes is needed to be brief, short, to intervene in a proper manner effectively. So that was the basic frame of the idea, to have some emergency poke of means and to be able to use it flexibly. Thank you.
Merci Madame la Directrice Générale et merci beaucoup à Monsieur Lamassoure pour la...
Thank you, Mr. Ramasso, for your response and your suggestion. I do think that the major challenge for the next MFF will start as of this year, particularly looking at the Border and Coast Guard agency. And the main challenge will be working with national administrations who are active in border and Coast Guard operations, and looking at how they are going to work together in a new structure. I've been director of the agency for 3 years, and I believe that for a long time now the agency was seen as a financing body. And I keep telling national administrations that we are not a bank, we are a stakeholder and an operational partner. And what you said, yes, offers us a solution. But we know that European citizens want to see the added value for security expenditure, and we need to show how we work alongside member states, that we do not replace any of their functions. So the example that was cited, creating the Schengen free movement area, we could have made better use of economies of scale, having a European level border guard, but for various reasons that wasn't possible. And the difficulties we're facing today, including availability of border guards for 2018, that boils down to member states' national level security challenges which they have to face. Some countries have reintroduced border checks. And so national administrations need to meet national challenges, having new national border checks, and at the same time also meet the requirements of European operations for Frontex operations. So there are limitations to this exercise in transferring the costs and staff to a European level. But I'm sure that this is a political debate, and as the director of an operational agency, of course, I'm happy to come and talk to political leaders and try and find a solution with them.
Cool. Would the other members of the panel want to react? And so we wrap up the panel
Sure.
like this. So we can go Mr. Wainwright to the left, and then we end up with Mr. Elger. Go ahead.
Just very one point in regard to the transfer of funds from national to European level, of course, is very political. Actually, in my world, for example, of fighting terrorism, cybercrime, that's not a good idea, because you need both. Actually, the nature of the threat has increased so exponentially, even in the last 3 years, that you need to invest more at the national level and the European level. The point is, you have to do it in a harmonious way, in an integrated way. And it's a slightly different point to what you made with your anecdote, but I think that's how I see it in my area.
Thank you very
much. Je vais également essayer de...
Well, I'll also try to respond to the question from Alain Lamassoure from the defence point of view. The real question here is similar for defence and for security. We have to take account of the increase in threats, both at national level and when it comes to European institutions, or in my case, NATO. The NATO budget went up by 4% last year. So for the first time, we have reached a stage where expenditure is going up. Now, when we have a new actor which appears because the Commission has decided to invest in this area and to invest quite substantially when it comes to defence, but it remains marginal. So we have to see how this money can be best used. And speaking as an attentive observer of these decisions, I wonder if this money is going to be used to add something. And we have this idea of added value. This won't just be extra money, but will it make it possible to do things on top of what is done now? And the focus on research is interesting, I think, because there you have 1 billion or 1.5 billion promised per year, which can really make a difference. Overnight, the Commission will be making the EU into a major player when it comes to research in this area. And secondly, I think it's also intelligent to encourage cooperation. Often a development of new technologies for surveillance drones, for example, which can also be used by Frontex, has in the past come up against the fact that when developing these technologies, there was always 20% which was missing, so that the 4 or 5 countries who wanted to work in this area could pool their resources. So I think there is a very interesting multiplier effect. We will mainly have defence expenditure being taken up by national budgets. I think that this is all very difficult, and we will have to have a permanent consultation and work very carefully so that we can select the best projects possible and to use the budget where it is most useful.
Thank you. My view is that what we've been discussing today, internal security and work on the external borders, are highly relevant and they true potential for strong value added on a European level. Now, I can't agree that that would mean that we have to expand the budget, because that would assume that we had exhausted all opportunity to increase efficiency in all other areas. Now, I have offered 2 candidates that, to my eye, offers less European value added, and that could easily be cut down in order to make room for these highly relevant projects. Bottom line, we can cater for these new priorities, these highly relevant priorities, within a budget that is restricted to 1% of GDI in Europe. That's my main message. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much to all the speakers. For the sake of efficiency, what I would suggest is that, well, we will do a round of applause, but before we close the panel, that the members of the following panel join this side of the table, and then that people profit to, for a technical pause to go out very fast and come back straight away so that we can start without further delays. But before we do so, thank you very much, wholeheartedly. Very interesting discussion. The positions were very clear, and I think we will all leave with a better understanding of the challenge ahead. So thank you. Please join me.
Thank you, Nadia. Very well done.
See you. Bye-bye, both. And good luck.
Thank you.
I hope you're wrong on the forecast on the number of terrorist attacks this year. I count every day, We're beyond the 5th of January. We're beyond the everyday count. So.
Only 360 more days to survive.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. À la prochaine.
À bientôt, avec plaisir. N'hésitez pas, et dans les conversations.
Sorry? You have to look for the... This is for the panelists. I see, okay, well, no. Ne, zdajle je začela postavljati nekaj. Tle, kjer on stoji. Okay. se vím, že prestalo. Kolik chceš procent do toho rozpočtu? Jsem už vidla. Jaz mislim, da sem pa prvo štela v slovenščini.
Ste tle in so rekli, da...
Hi again. I don't know if they're changing the names.
So it's in the process.
Okay, excellent.
Voilà, il fait remarquablement.
Vous avez pas vu. Je croyais que vous allez parler de own resources, de ressources propres.
Non, non, mais...
Je croyais que vous allez dire qu'il pourrait avoir de nouveaux ressources propres.
Non, je n'ai pas pu venir hier, malheureusement.
Très bien.
Oui, c'était très très bien. Je fais très bons échos, comment allez-vous?
Ah, they have changed me. Okay, well, thank you very much for the very efficient. We're still missing some people, but we're going to get started. Please fill the seats. You know, it may be that some people are not coming to the second panel, although this is surely going to be an extremely interesting discussion. So welcome to those that were not with us in the previous discussion, which focused on defense and security. Now we're moving to a very different area of reflection on the next multi-annual financial framework, which is how to maximize the benefit and the added value and the performance that we acquire from the expenditure of every euro of European taxpayers' money. Before we go into the substance, I would like to just repeat the language regime. You may speak and listen to in French, German, English, obviously, Czech, although, yeah, the Czech minister has left now, but Lithuanian. You can speak Czech, of course, Jan. Lithuanian and Slovenian. So enough for the housekeeping comments. As I was saying, this panel is going to be getting into the substance and one of the key issues that we are reflecting on when we are talking about the European budget, which is how to maximize the economic impact. And when we're looking at effective ways to maximize this economic impact, we need to reflect on other ways to spend the money. Yeah, just in the previous panel, we were talking about direct implementation through European agencies, which is a very different way to implement European policies. Now we will probably talk more about other instruments alternative to grants and traditional subsidies, such as financial instruments. We have been extending our action in this area. The European Fund for Strategic Investment is a paramount example of this new way to spend the money. And in order to discuss what are the lessons learned and what is the main, what else should we be doing in the next Multiannual Financial Framework, we have an excellent panel of speakers with us today. The keynote presentation will be done by Jorge Núñez Ferrer, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for European Studies. He's a well-known expert on the European budget. And then we will follow the order of the program, starting with Madame Erman, the Minister of Finance for Slovenia. Then Migle Tuskene, the Vice Minister of Finance of Lithuania, who will provide us with a point of view of the member states. Alexander Stubb, who represents the European Investment Bank, although he has a very long and well-known career in various positions. And finally, Jan Gregor, the member of the European Court of Auditors. So without further delay, I give the floor to Jorge.
Thank you very much for inviting me to come here. It's a privilege to speak to all of you in this panel. I have a very complicated subject. They put me the subtitle there, Grant Subsidies and Innovative Financial Instruments. This is extremely technical, and I'm not going to give a technical presentation, so don't worry. There are many angles that I could take this. This is like version I don't know what of the presentation. There are so many, and I had to take out things in and things out. But let's try to do it in the time I was given. So first of all, is back to basics. I just want to say there are words in there that are very important: high, impact, and limited. So I will keep on to these three, but I added economic and social. The reason I put social is something I will not present here, but we are doing an analysis of data of all over Europe. I can tell you that there is a change, economic change in the EU. There are shifts, and you can see GDP and employment shifts in large parts of Europe in opposite directions. And I have to say, this covers whole countries sometimes. And I think that if you only focus on economic impact, it goes only in some places. And the long-term stability of the EU does have a European value added too. That's just to say, it means reforms of some policies, but this is worrying. So we are looking at all the indicators, we are doing big analysis. I'm not presenting this today, but I just noticed also from the previous presentation here in the morning that there is still no feeling on that. Now, let's go for these words, high, impact, and limited. What does it mean? We do have an opportunity now, historically, to get a more modern budget under these three, but there are conditions for this high and limited and modern. First of all, you have to have a budget that is flexible and reactive because you have limited resources, so you need that. You need a better focus, and we have had this for results, the budget for results, and that's okay on efficiency, but they also need the focus. It means also reallocation. We need less, let's say, pre-allocation. Just to give money to someone and then to say, let's see if you get the project to actually cover it. We could have a little bit more about, maybe we could have larger regional groups. I'm saying this with regional funding. So there's a little bit of competition, a bit of more flexibility, and the one that has better projects and all this. Very unpleasant for many, but why not? There needs to be a better division between instruments. We do have new instruments now, financial instruments. There is a reason for that. You know, some people are, I mean, I find it sometimes very strange. There are financial instruments used in projects that before were done with grants, and then people are upset because they're not done with grants anymore. And then I'm saying, sorry, wait, but if a financial instrument is possible, it means that you were getting grants for something that should not get grants. They have a different role. what you're trying to do with financial instruments in grants is to have a combination with finances, what has to be financed with grants and what can be financed a bit differently, and you try to find the equilibrium. This means that you're trying to distribute risks between the private and the public sector in a way that, you know, nobody gets a free meal when it's not necessary. And that's the whole point. So there is a work in trying to get a better division, and it is quite good, the development that has happened, but we have to keep it efficient, and that's the next issue. So then the better division of responsibility. In that, I'm speaking about the responsibility between the EU, the national, the regional, but also the private sector and private financial institutions, other public financial institutions. That means you have to use the funding better, and you have to know to whom you're giving and who is managing, and in a way that is efficient and more appropriate. So there is an opportunity to improve this. And it has to be, the budget has to be more integrated. I will speak a lot about this. There is less fragmentation of procedures, less rules that are separated, issues about auditing, controls and support. There is to make it more efficient, to have more impact, to be more successful. And let me show you the budget today, which is an issue. The budget is very unwieldy to be efficient. We have, in the first part, we have a lot of DGs. They have their own projects, their own systems. You have, for example, projects in ICT, in energy, and in transport on that are on smart cities. They don't communicate with them. You have different procedures, and then you have different reporting. You have projects that work with two grants that come from two different DGs, and you're reporting differently to each of them for the same project. And obviously this causes a lot of problems and and it's a bit inefficient. But then you have also the financial instruments, which you have shared and central, and I see that there are a lot of overlaps. A lot of these overlaps and all of this happened to a certain extent because the budget for many years, especially since the crisis hit, has been running behind events. So you're reacting, creating solutions, but the question now is, how do we now pause for a moment? And this is an opportunity. We do see now the economy is not collapsing. We have a moment that looks somehow acceptable. Let's try to clean up the house before the next one starts and try to have a bit more coherence and therefore also more efficiency and more effectiveness. What we see here is a lot of unnecessary overlaps and necessary divisions between all of these strands. So there is a way to improve that. Plus, we have different rules, as I said. We have different auditing rules around. We have double and triple layers in some cases, sometimes because of national issues too. It's not only the EU auditing, it's national overlapping and all these projects. So there are ways to simplify this. And then, as I said, the different reporting. So let's go. Can we move to a more simplified structure? This is a dream budget. Let's say you have grants, because we actually in the budget, it is incredible how complicated it is, but we have two instruments, grants and financial instruments. And it is the way is how many divisions have been created into the grant system and rules and procedures and different, that causes that the budget then becomes more unwieldy. So the first thing is less sectoral divisions. If you can see, the word agriculture doesn't appear. I think agriculture is an economic sector. It has social problems, has environmental problems, so you can divide into areas. I will mention slightly agriculture because it's not about funding, it's about efficiency. It's not about the size, it's about other issues. And you have these groups, let's say, and we're trying to have less sectoral divisions, more cooperation, less differences if you're dealing with one DG or another and so on. Who cares? The important thing is, what are you financing? And the next is common rules and procedures, something that is combined with the financial instruments and so on. And there I'm speaking about one pot for maximizing risk sharing. I will speak about it later. I'm speaking here about efficiency. Everybody's speaking about a single rule book. We have to have one book to manage everything. So let's put everything into one book so we have not so many rules, and we have the financial instruments and the grants all in one group. And my question is, what kind of book? Because honestly, good. Or is this the objective is to create one book? It's a bit risky. So do we want a thin and clear book, or do we have that one? In regional policy, the number of pages of regional and the regulations have multiplied by 3, I think, in the last 10 years. a bit more than 10 years, but anyway, by 3, it's a lot. These are from 2,500 pages to 3 times more. What does it mean? We need a real simplification. And then on things like financial instruments, I was looking at some rules, and also in other parts, the ex-ante, there is a lot of paperwork, ex-ante analysis, which are hundreds of pages that nobody reads, and of which 200 pages of the, let's say 300 pages are historical, irrelevant, theoretical, but the actual function of the instrument is what matters, and there I see weaknesses. So there is a meaningful position, and I'm very sorry for all of the ones that are professional consultants. They will have less pages to write. But the point is to be effective in their documentation. This happens in many, so there is a lot to be done there to improve it. So we have to focus on quality, clear division of responsibilities, and then I want just to mention again why there is the issue about grants and financial instruments. Everybody's very worried that they're going to substitute each other. This is not about that. It's not the point. You have grants that are for public goods that nobody's going to finance otherwise. Okay? And then you have grants and financial instruments together, maybe, or separate, which is grants and financial instruments. You combine them. There are parts of projects that simply nobody wants to finance. And you can have a project that has different compartments. Different compartments. Maybe there's a project that has a very important social element, and really nobody wants to get into that because it doesn't have any returns. It's part of a larger project. You keep the grants for that piece, and you do something else. And the other thing is, you're looking at very important for financial instruments is I'm a bit annoyed when people speak about market failure, market failure, market failure. Market failure is theoretically very easy to demonstrate in every area. There is always a market failure. What's important is when nobody is going to finance it. But if you have some support or a backing from the EIB and so on, people are ready to go in. They need this backing. You activate. If there is nobody that they can activate because it's too public, too risky, to whatever, then there is no financial instrument you can use. And this is something also that I find very often that people don't understand. There are areas where you should not be doing financial instruments because simply you need financial instrument is it's a banking instrument, needs the money back. This is a message, so you cannot put it everywhere. But it's really the important thing is this market gap. And market gaps can appear when you have high economic growth. The economy goes fantastically well. A project is profitable, but it's not profitable enough to attract interest for anybody. Then you need it. Maybe when the economy is doing well too. So there is this issue that's why I prefer to speak about market gaps than to speak about market failure. Market failure is too philosophical for me. Market gap is simply nobody comes. Very easy. Financial instruments. Only you need the market gap, but they are useful when they operate alone. And I introduced it with FC2 and all of this. Well, they have to have, of course, the high public value and low interest. Now, from efficiency point of view, I want to explain something that's just pure economist. When you have on the ground, you use some regional funding or something to do a small financial instrument to support some marginal issue. Well, it may look very good, but it will be more costly. You concentrate the risk on one issue. I saw some funding, financial instruments for a cultural or sector in a region. So then what happens is that you have the risk concentrated on one activity, so it's very expensive to cover the risk. On one sector, so when they have a crisis in the sector, then all of your loans are damaged. It's like an insurance. So the best is to have the funding, even if you introduce your own instruments regionally, that the backing of this, first of all, you need a larger portfolio, a larger things to cover, and second, it is better to have the funding even on a larger pot that covers risk across Europe, so your interest rates keep lower because you are guaranteed by all the operations across Europe and not in a regional link. But I see many people are worried to put it in a larger pot. Doesn't mean you lose the money. You reduce the risk on the money you're transferring over. So this is why I put all this shared management underneath with a big portfolio. We haven't reached that, but this is I'm speaking here about economic impact, efficiency, and reducing costs. I'm not here speaking about, this is my regional money, I want to have my own little instrument, and I don't want to give it to the EIB because the EIB, they will eat it, and then maybe someone else benefits from my money. That's not the point. It's about efficiency. Now, fundamentals is my last slide, really. First of all, another point that is, I want to here speak about certain things. It's very nice to have financial instruments. It's very nice to have grants, but please, there is a third pillar of the FC Juncker plan that was mentioned, but it's a third pillar for every policy and for grants. It's structural reforms. Please, where are they? Where are they? I sometimes see when FC has come and financial instruments, everybody finds it great. We don't need to reform because there is the EIB that was coming and give you some loans, and we can maintain our inefficient labor policy and inefficient things. No, this is not possible. The other thing is the temptation that the EU budget or the EIB or whatever can go. It's there to correct, to cover market gaps and to correct for policy failures. It's not that, sorry, to correct for market failures. It's not that to correct policy failures. If you have a policy failure, your first instinct should not be to get some easy money from somewhere. It's to solve the policy failure. Another issue here, I put finally because I changed the list, sorry. But the other thing is governments should be better managers of their money. They are sitting on 50% of GDP. It's public, if you see. And I'm now working with a public financial management team, it's a global team of advisors. We were looking at it, and I'm really thinking, you know, if you want to manage EU funding properly, normally countries that do it properly have also good management of their own funding. It's a public management. How much GDP is lost from mismanagement of assets of member states, of government things, and this is partly because of the standard. You cannot find it even in their books. So international standards on reporting, and then the management, public management standards are low. And these are things that have to be solved. These are national priorities, and you cannot blame only the EU on everything. So there's a lack of proper standards and public financial management, and this dampens GDP, and it has also deepened the crisis effect on some countries because they were absolutely not, you know, the money was not easily available, and they didn't have the management of their own money properly. Finally, final message on the budget. It is the cap, yes. And we heard some presentations today. I think that when a budget is limited, you have to ask what you pay through the budget. So let's imagine you don't touch the cap, because people think I'm asking of reform. I abandoned about asking reform. This is not about reform anymore. You keep the same rule. You force every country to keep the same payment. Let's imagine it just like that. Just fix it. And you say, but you are not going to send the money into Brussels to get it back. Most of the cap is self-financing your own policy. And then it's totally pre-allocated. It's not by application, so you don't apply you're not competing with anybody. It's even less than regional policy. So you have this 45 billion, of which around 10 something is really falling somewhere else. So now I'm saying, is there not a way? And I was thinking about a system like cohesion, where it's depending on the fiscal capacity of countries, how much you transfer. With the same rule, 75%, you get the whole of the direct payments, not co-finance. Then you have another whatever. And the funny thing is I got to something similar to the 10 billion. It was quite funny. I actually didn't expect it. But the point is this, that most of the funding is going through. And if it's like this for a policy that doesn't compete, it's not that it goes to Brussels and is allocated in a different rule, it's a payment per hectare. Then why? When you have a 1% restriction, why is it going through Brussels? It's quite damaging, to be honest. Then the agricultural policy lacks point. It needs to be, if you want efficiency, it needs to change, because the payments are based on something happened in 1989 at the WTO. Most people have forgotten. It was the GATT at the time. They agreed on certain systems. So they are linked indirectly to this decision at the time. And that's why payments across farms in Europe are very different between countries. But it's nothing to do with the costs of production, with the cost of the environment, with the cost of anything at all. So you're getting this funding. It's totally inefficient, it's totally distortive, so it's not about here. Some people are saying, oh, don't touch them, it's distortive. No, you don't touch them, it's distortive. So you have a distorted policy, and we are passing it all through Brussels. And I'm saying, well, you either reform or you just don't pay it through Brussels, but just leave the poor budget a bit in peace, okay? And don't send something. Now, how is the policy? Like, last sentence, I want to do this, last sentence. If you did a social policy and gave 10 euros to every for a square meter of the house, so to support poor families, you give 10 euros per square meter to everybody, rental support, and you give it to everybody. Would you find it normal? And then, by the way, you give only 5 to the ones that are in marginal areas. And then you say we have a social policy. We are supporting their incomes. Well, that's agriculture in other words. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jorge. But of course, you finish with an assertion that could take us hours to get into. but thank you very much, because you have given me the opportunity to announce something which many of the people today here maybe don't know, which is that the last decision taken under the Estonian presidency was actually in the Council the adoption of a significant review of the financial regulation and 15 other regulations, which is a first step of the single and better, or simpler and shorter, streamlined, I would add, rule book, and which has introduced or will introduce, we are now awaiting the final okay of the European Parliament, and then we will start announcing it and explaining it in detail. But it does introduce significant changes in terms of the interaction between grants and financial instruments, facilitating it greatly, in particular for EFSI. It does create a new Title 10 for all financial instruments, so there is a coherent set of rules, at least for all of them, and guarantees, and etc. And an important move towards single audit. So at least, you know, I could explain more details, but at least 3 areas in which I am very happy, and we will cut by around 30% the number of articles and words and rules. So it is a significant simplification. We will have more chances to explain, but since you mentioned it, I took the opportunity to inform you of this important development. It's not the end of the story. Well, now let's turn to the members of the panel. Starting with, as I said, we were going to follow the order, so starting with Madame Herman. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. And I would like to start by wishing you all a very happy and successful New Year. And as I have a unique opportunity to address you in such a large number in my mother tongue, in Slovenian, allow me to continue in Slovenian language. Za današnjo predstavitev.
For today, I've prepared a presentation, but I will not bore you with all the information in it. I would only like to outline some crucial information as to the application of financial instruments in Slovenia. During the financial crisis, we've become more aware of the significance of financial instruments. We have public funds, not only European, but also domestic or national funds, and these have diminished over time. And they will continue to diminish in the future. Slovenia first encountered financial instruments in 2011. Back then, we formed a specific fund for research and development. We dedicated 50 million euro public funds and 100 million euros private funds. In 2013, a similar fund was established in order to support SMEs at a much larger scale. And then in 2016, another fund, or facility rather, was established also for SMEs. Now, before starting the implementation of financial instruments in the current financial perspective, we reviewed the results of these 3 measures which had been implemented in the past. And we've come across the following deficiencies. First of all, as regards the financial instruments, or instruments for the implementation of financial instruments, several institutions were responsible. Each of them had its own rules, its own modus operandi. And this was addressed by forming or nominating only one institution which would be in charge of the management of the fund of funds, which I will come back to a bit later. We found out that the legislative solutions provided for by our national legislation do not provide sufficient framework for the implementation of financial instruments. This was especially the case in the light of a special fund which we are trying to form for the rural development. We've had no sufficient legal framework for this area. And another potential problem, if national rules differ from European rules, public funds which are being used for financial instruments are used at the European and national level. For me, as the Minister of Finance, European and national funds are equally important. Now, the next problem which we encountered was the question of sufficient and efficient use of funds and the issue of transparency of such use. We've encountered a difference of opinion between our Slovene Court of Auditors and our Ministry of Finance. Before we started the drawing of funds from the current financial perspective, we've decided to streamline these views, and this enabled us to avoid repeated warnings of the Court of Auditors with regard to the review of our annual budget. Every year we were criticized because we did not fully apply the position or the opinion of our Court of Auditors. Now we've managed to streamline and harmonize these positions. Slovenia also found it quite difficult to accept the fact that not everything can be financed through subsidies or donations or grants, rather, which had just been mentioned by Jorge. This means that we need to raise the awareness and the knowledge at the ministerial level and also at the level of other actors who use public funds. We need to present all the advantages of such instruments. However, the same financial instruments cannot be applied for all areas or for all policies. Based on this fact, we've established a new framework for the implementation of the financial instruments within the current financial perspective. We hope to be able to use this foundation to build financial instruments also within the next financial perspective, because it is quite clear that these will become more and more important throughout the coming years, not only due to limited resources. Also, if a country were to use the applicable resources correctly, especially through cohesion policy and rural development policy, then the results should be visible. The country has to keep up with the average of the development level in the EU, and this European aspect of funds is being reduced. It cannot be completely replaced by national resources, so it should therefore be complemented with private funds. What have we done? We've established a fund of funds, which is one of the institutions in charge of the implementation of financial instruments. These funds will then reach end users via financial intermediaries, which is the banking system. The manager of the fund of funds is the Slovenian Development Bank, the SID Bank. The agreement between the bank and the state was signed in November 2017, and the tenders to allocate funds to financial intermediaries will be chosen at the beginning of this year. Now on the slide you can see the structure of governance of the fund of funds. Everything is based on a single structure. This is very important, and the funds are provided for 5 priority areas. One of them is SME financing. This is one of the crucial market gaps which we've detected after the economic crisis. Then we have agriculture, or rural development within agriculture. The third priority area is research and development for startups. The fourth priority area is energy efficiency. And the fifth area is urban development. I've already mentioned the fact that all these 5 areas will be managed in the same way. This will prevent a selection of a more favorable provider, which will help us avoid abuse. And this will also help us better steer public policies, which are being determined on the basis of an agreement between the state and the SID Bank. As I've said, the same financial instruments cannot be used for each of these areas. As you can see on the screen, I've left out the rural development priority because we're at the starting phase of the project. As far as research and development is concerned, we have guarantees and loans. When it comes to the SMEs, we have guarantees, loans, and equity financing. For energy efficiency and urban development, we have primarily loans. To conclude, financial instruments and public funds are provided for to the tune of 253 million euros. Together with private funds, we will be able to provide more than 370 million euros, which means we will have even more funds available for public policies, which can be financed through financial instruments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. I think that you have touched upon 2 or 3 very important subjects that will come back in the other speakers' time, I'm sure. The importance of a good articulation between European and national funds. Jorge referred to it. You have put it on the table. Very good concrete proposals and ideas. The fund of funds. The role of the Slovenian Development Bank, something that maybe Mr. Stubb will want to say a word on from the EIB perspective, the different areas which you consider to be a priority and suitable for financial instruments. Thank you very much for this very concrete presentation. And I give the floor to Madame Tuskienė, Vice Minister from Lithuania.
Thank you, Nadia, for inviting. I believe this is a very timely discussion. Soon you will release your proposal and we will have to take important decisions and difficult choices ahead of us. But I do believe the only goal we have, whatever size your budget will be, to spend it in a best possible way. Of course, we have our own ideas how to do that. But if we look back at the last two multi-annual financial frameworks, the trend is clear. Amount of EU resources implemented via financial instrument is constantly increasing. And this happens both for direct management, but also for shared management programs. And our experience is very positive as well. So we are very happy with our financial instruments, which we are implementing from structural funds. In the previous financial framework, we allocated 7% of all cohesion policy amount implemented via financial instruments, and currently we are aiming at 10%. So I would say we ourselves, we are pioneers of financial instruments. And I do agree with previous speakers that probably this trend will continue in the future. We will need to use financial instruments more widely than before that. And of course, when you use financial instruments, you achieve many good goals. Of course, you are able to attract financially viable projects, and for sustainable projects, you can use reflows in the future, and so you spend not only now, but you make a buffer for the future. Your total investment is much bigger because you attract private investments, so you leverage, and your total investment is much higher. But what is most important, I believe, you change mentality of public investment, and you reduce dependence on grants, which is very much important. Having said that, I would stress that we should not run from one extreme to another one. There are plenty of projects which are very much important for convergence, for competitiveness, which do not generate enough profit. And here grants, or maybe a mixture of grants and financial instruments, is the right way to implement them. Can cohesion policy, can grants create high economic impact? I believe it can. Take again our example. When we joined the EU in 2004, our GDP per capita was at 50, barely at 50% of EU average. Only in 10 years. Only in 10 years, in 2014, we've reached 75%. I believe it's incredible economic impact. So if implemented efficiently, properly, I think grants also create a high economic value. But what we need at the end of the day, I believe this is a right mixture. A right mixture of all instruments and sources at our hand. And here complementarity is very much important. Instruments should not compete with each other, but complement, not to duplicate. Here I would like to a bit disagree with Mr. Nunes' notion of financial instruments at national level. Again, we have very good experience with EIB as well on how to top up financial instruments at national level with centralized financial instruments. So I do believe in the future we should keep this possibility to run financial instruments also from structural finance, from structural funds at national level. I agree that centralized mechanism, we do have advantages, but we also have disadvantages. So according to our market participants, we are quite happy with national financial instruments. We are, because we can react to the market needs better and to be more flexible. So we need to look for a proper mixture. And last but not least, simplification. This has been a key word for the last few years already, and I'm happy, Nadia, you mentioned that some substantial progress is achieved already in this area. I still believe there is room for improvement. From a legal point of view, we could better align regulations and requirements, and also we would expect financial instruments in the future to be more flexible, better react to the market needs, and to be closer to usual business practice. To sum up, I think first we need to decide on our priorities, on the targets we want to achieve, on the type of projects we want to finance, and when to find a proper mixture. I mean, moving from grants to financial instruments should not become a target in itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Migle, not only for being very clear, for giving us a second very positive example, a very successful example of the use of different tools and a good use of the European budget, but also for keeping it short and allowing us to reach our own targets in terms of the timing of this panel. Now I move to the representative of one of the key players in this area, Mr. Stubb. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just a quick correction before we start. I see that my name tag says S. Stubb. It's very kind. The name of my wife is Suzanne. So in that sense, it works. And when we got married, she was humming and hawing what name to use. Her maiden name is Ines. So she was figuring out which direction Ines Stubb. And she decided to go for Ines Stubb because otherwise it would have been Stubbiness. So I have taken a picture of this and sent it to her. In my 5 minutes, I'll make a very brief introduction, then pose 3 questions, and then draw a quick conclusion. The brief introduction is to say that my first touch with the financial framework was actually at the College of Europe in Bruges in 1994 with the legendary Jean-Paul Jacquet. And the question that I was posed in my oral exam was, Monsieur Stubb, procédure de budget, s'il vous plaît. And I had to utter it out. My next touch was as a deputy Antici during the Finnish presidency when we were preparing Agenda 2000. My third touch was at the group of policy advisors, which was a president to the European Political Strategy Center here at the European Commission when we were working on the Sapir report, which I think is still a standard of thinking on the financial framework, both in terms of own resources and policies. And then my final touch was first as Europe Minister in 2013 and then as Prime Minister in 2014 when we were finalizing the financial framework for 2014 to 2020. And when I was listening to the debate yesterday, I felt a little bit, not a little bit, a big sense of déjà vu. And what I would call for in this room is to try to avoid to go back into the old potholes of net contributors, net receivers, cohesion countries, non-cohesion countries, but start thinking about this process a little bit bigger. What usually happens, to be quite honest, in these, and I've worked in all the different institutions, is that the European Parliament shoots for the stars, the European Commission shoots for the moon, and then the European Council brings us all down to earth. That's the basic way in which things usually go. And unfortunately, the difference between Earth and the moon is usually 0.1% of GDP of the whole area. And I really want to try to avoid that. And that's one of the reasons why I find this seminar so important. If I have one thesis that you might want to jot down or take from this discussion is to say that I personally do not believe that the budget of the European Union will increase. As a matter of fact, much like it did the last time around, and especially in light of Brexit, it is very possible that it will decrease. And in that sense, I think we need to be innovative, and I think we need to not move away from grants, but realize that we have come to the end of the road of an increasing in the amount of grants, and therefore focus on a completely new instrument, or not new, but an instrument which has proved, I think, its teeth and its efficiency in the past few years, namely financial instruments and budget guarantees. So my 3 questions today then. Number 1, why do we need more financial instruments and budget guarantees? I think Jorge put it very well in 3 words: high, impact, and limited. And I think that sums it up quite well. But there are 3 reasons for it. Number 1 is that we don't have enough money. And let's not pretend that the redistributive value of the European Union will increase. Therefore, we have to use new instruments. 2, as a matter of fact, the financial instruments have proved to be a better use of limited resources. I'll just give you one example, which people very rarely cite, and believe me, I'm an institutional nerd, but not even I knew this. But if you look at the EU budget today, it's approximately 150 billion euros per annum, more or less. If you look at the firepower of the EIB and what it leverages, we're talking at over 250 billion euros per annum. So the EIB's firepower is bigger than the EU budget firepower, but we very rarely discuss the financial instruments, but we quite often discuss who gets what, when, where, and how, in which policy area. The third and final reason for financial instruments is that they crowd in investments. I don't care if you use the term market failures or gaps or whatever. But basically what happens if the EIB comes into a project with, say, 50%, you immediately get the crowding in of private investors. And if I was a member state, and I'm not anymore, I'd be looking at how I spend my money. And I would immediately see that I get more bang for the buck with a financial instrument than I actually get with a grant. And I am not, I hesitate to say this, I say this again, I am not advocating the idea that we should get rid of grants. All I'm saying is we need to start using financial instruments a little bit more. And just to prove the point, I think the Juncker plan, EFSI, has been a success. It was a great idea, and the partnership between the European Commission and the EIB has been extremely good with this, and I think it has worked quite well. The second question, what should we expect? And perhaps this is where I throw the question to the chair a little bit to a certain extent. What should we expect in May? The hypothesis that we are working with is most probably a proposition or a proposal of a single fund of sorts. The second hypothesis that we're working with, and here I think it's very important to clarify, we would expect or assume that approximately 10% of the budget will be allocated to some kind of financial instruments or grants or mandates. So 10% out of the total cake. This is just a hypothesis. I just want to keep that clearly in mind, that people understand that we're not talking here about getting rid of the grants and juxtaposing, like Migle said very well. It's not one or the other. It's actually, I think, both. The third assumption that we have, I think we heard very well and clearly in the seminar yesterday, is the total sum, which is not the subject of this, but what Oettinger said yesterday was 1.1x will be the suggestion. More than 1%, but less than 2%. And also that funds will not be cut from Horizon or Erasmus, which I personally think is good. The third and final question I have, what are the basic principles of these financial instruments or grants? And I would outline the first one, the following one. Number one, I think it's very important that we keep in mind our treaties, and that it is the European Investment Bank, the EU's bank, that is focused on investment and the implementation of that investment. We have been doing that for 60 years, and I would argue that we should continue to do that. Number two, when we talk about a level playing field, I would argue that the EIB is above that level playing field. We are the ones who, together with the Commission, work with the investments and with the implementations, because it is our job to do that. Number three, we should avoid all duplication and overlap in whatever we do. And that's why I think Jorge's boxes there were very helpful in explaining how it should work out. Number four, my second to last principle, is that we should stick to the EIB's governance integrity and maintain the traditional business model. In other words, yes, the EIB is willing to move more in the direction of mandates, but let's by no means go anywhere near 1/3 of our business going through mandates, because we simply will not be able to, first of all, administer, secondly, afford that package. So we will continue with what we do in our normal business, but once we start taking on the mandates, it's very important that we look at our business model as well. And the final point I wanted to make, and this is the banker in me, I guess, is to say that whatever we do, I think the EIB is not in the business of altruism. Yes, we are not a bank that works for profit, but the bottom line is that we need adequate remuneration when we do this. We are a competitive bank. We cannot be a loss-making bank, because if we become a loss-making bank, then we will be also a loss for the member states. So my conclusion, therefore, is, number one, yes, continue with the grants, but let's start looking more innovatively at financial instruments and guarantees. Two, the reason for this, that this is the best way to use our scarce resources. And three, when we move towards this model, it should be based on a few strict principles, some of which I just outlined. And with my former finance minister and prime minister hat, let me conclude by saying I fully agree with you, Jorge. This does not mean that the member states should stop doing structural reforms. No, those needs to go on as has before. Thank you very much.
Very much, Alexander. Thank you very much for that, for being very short, for being to the point, and for sending out some very clear messages on the role. If there is one good thing coming out of the EFSI, which maybe has not been highlighted enough, is the much closer cooperation between the European Investment Bank and the European Commission. And I think that is one of those win-win situations. Like in the previous panel, we were discussing the relationship with Nato. You know, that is one of the good developments that that maybe come out of crisis or additional challenges. Let me turn to the final speaker, which will give us a very different perspective, I think, Mr. Gregor, also looking at how to scrutinize, how to control and to audit financial instruments.
Thank you very much for the floor, Nadia. I was thinking to start along the same lines as Alex, to just raise and say my touches with the financial perspective. It started 2 decades ago, where my initial task as the Minister of Finance was, yeah, you better learn the EU budget and get ready for enlargement. And my answer was, who's going to help? And the other answer was nobody. So you can imagine that at that time, the conclusions of the Berlin summit of '99, when the perspective was approved for that period, it came as a Christmas gift, because I was able to study the allocation methodologies for cohesion. Then I topped it up with agriculture, etc. And then in the 3 following rounds, in the Copenhagen summit 2002, I was sitting behind my Prime Minister as well as for the other 2 perspectives. So it seems to be similar for all the perspectives, not that variant as in Alex's case, but still I'm happy that I would be still part of the process, this time from the perspective of the EU institutions, from the perspective of the Court of Auditors. And I was also thinking, how can we define the negotiation of the financial perspective? So perhaps it's the art of cooking, when you have to have the right ingredients, and they are relatively simple. You have to create time pressure, of course. You have to lock heads of state into one single room, make them tired, make them change shirts, and decrease a little bit of transparency so they do not know what the other get. And, of course, to enable them that they sell the result of the perspective back home as a good result for their respective countries. Sounds easy, but in reality it's much more difficult than that. But now let me turn to the perspective of the Court of Auditors. And you may imagine it's very difficult to comment from the audit institution, because we usually look at issues exposed 2-3 years, and then we follow up our recommendations another 3 years. So it's relatively challenging, and we have to combine the results of the past audit work of the Court of Auditors and our accumulated knowledge and, of course, individual experience of our colleagues. And looking at the title of the panel, I have to say that Court of Auditors is not advocating for a limited budget, but rather for a budget which would enable to meet EU ambitions. And therefore, we are preparing a number of briefing papers in 2018. Let me perhaps start with 2 briefing papers. One would be on general reflection on the budget principles, which we hope to publish somewhere in January, February, so really shortly. The other one would be more detailed reflection on the Commission proposal, ideally to be published in June, July. And of course, at the appropriate point of time, we would be providing our opinions on the legislative proposals, including own resources and sectoral regulations. I have now 5 principles I would like to share with the colleagues. First, of course, is a long-term, maybe you can say even political issue. It's the unity of European Union. And I always ask myself whether the EU budget strong redistributive function is needed for the long-term existence of the EU. And I always answer myself, yes, this is needed. And we have heard number of times yesterday that we should get rid of the net balance concept. I think this is true, but it's not that easy to be done, because it was also criticized by Mario Monti, and he was saying that in his report that there is a need to look critically at the current methodology of net balances. And as the Commission rightly says in the financial reports, this allocation of expenditure to member states is merely an accounting process, and it does not reflect the benefits that each member state derives from the membership in the EU. And definitely there are numerous other non-financial and indirect benefits gained to the EU policies, including single market, economic integration and trade, etc. And I would support the suggestion of that working group that at least there is a study which would kind of try to analyze and assess the non-financial and indirect benefits of the EU membership. And ideally, in the long run, it would be a hard challenge for the Commission to have it as a kind of permanent assessment, at least once per financial perspective, that this can be clearly communicated to member states. Of course, then let me move to a next point, which is unity of the EU budget. And from our perspective, there is a need to develop and apply common principles of accountability, transparency, and public audit for all types of financing of the EU policies. So not only the central EU budget and close satellites, but also more distant satellites, including the new monetary fund and also including the EIB in the long run. In this area, we base our views on the 2014 landscape review on the gaps, overlaps, and challenges. And this was focused on accountability and public audit arrangements. And there we described 6 elements: that there is always a need for clear definition of roles and responsibilities, management assurance about achievements of policy objectives, full democratic oversight, existence of feedback loops to allow corrective action, and a strong mandate of the external auditor to verify accounts compliance and performance, and finally implementation of audit recommendations and audit follow-up. Another area and principle I want to mention is the area of simplification, and there we have to be really careful for whom we are suggesting the simplification, because in the past we were lacking the simplification for the beneficiaries. And I share that it would be a real challenge for us to get to a single rule book. It was mentioned by Jorge how many pages we have. We also had a brainstorming in the court. And looking at the guidance, we started with 170 pages for 2000-2006. Then we continued with 1,457 pages in 2007-13, and we are now getting to 3,089 pages of guidance for 2014-20. So yes, it's a good objective, but at the same time, it's a real challenge, having in mind the recent developments. Simplification should be applied to all areas of the budget, including revenues. There I have my own private long-term ideal world of financing the EU just by traditional resources, which are linked to the existence of internal market and GNI. That would be it, my ideal world. Don't ask me whether this is realistic. The answer would be easy, but I would like to have the revenue side without any rebates, and we could also get rid of this regressivity on the revenue side. On the expenditure side, the court is also going to prepare a number of briefing papers, one on agriculture, on the future of agriculture policy, second on the simplification of cohesion policy, and another one on the Horizon 2020. When I mention revenues and expenditure, I should also add that there is a possible simplification, eventually possible simplification in the area of audit. People quite often mention the single audit approach. We made a substantial effort to move towards, if you can call it single audit, but we rather call it more reliance on other auditors. It's not unconditional, so we will make a lot of pressure on the Commission to improve their own audit arrangements. I could give you one example in the external policies. There, it's carried out by the external audit company, which does not do it according to international standards, but rather up to the agreed upon procedures. They don't fly on spots. So there are some nuances which have to be done, and I guess we are on the right track, but it would take some more couple of years. Another area is performance of the EU budget, and I hope that the Court of Auditors is a good partner to the European Commission, and together we try to cultivate the performance framework of the European Commission. For example, in 2016 annual report of the Court, we have included Chapter 3 on performance, and there I can share 2 recommendations in this area which are agreed with the Commission. One is to decrease number of objectives and indicators of the EU. We have now about 300 objectives and 700 indicators. It's very complex, so for the definition of the next programs, we could try to simplify. And another recommendation is that the Commission takes some degree of responsibility for the performance data which are submitted from member states. And as the title of the panel also included financial instruments, let me also share our audit work in this area. We published in 2016 an implementation report on implementing the EU budget through financial instruments, and with subtitle Lessons to be learned from the 2007 till 13 programming period. And we clearly say that they are good if they are properly implemented. They may mobilize private capital, and of course they are of a revolving nature, so they can be invested in several cycles. In this period, there were 1,046 financial instruments that were implemented, including 21 centrally managed by the Commission, and the total was 21.5 billion euros. And it continued to grow in between programming periods. Our audit nevertheless identified a number of significant issues that limited efficiency of the financial instruments. So we can combine Jorge's 3 keynotes also in a way that we used the 2 that impact was limited. Significant numbers of ERDF and ESF financial instruments were oversight, so they were not matching the market demand or the gap. And they continue to face significant problems in distributing their capital endowments, on average around 57% of all capital endowments paid to the OPs from financial instruments had been used. Overall, financial instruments in both shared and central managements were not successful in too much in attracting private capital, and only so far, only a limited number of financial instruments have been successful in providing revolving financial support. We also negatively commented high levels of fees in certain cases, and I have to admit that the legislation for 2014-20 took on board those criticisms, but not all of them. So we will continue to keep an eye on the development. And allow me a final personal note related to financial instruments based on my previous experience. And if my information is correct, there is also a difficulty in the area of statistical treatment of financial instruments. In some of the countries, the development banks are treated in the financial sector outside the public budget accounts, while in some other countries it's within public accounts. Thank you very much for your attention.
And I think that the composition of this panel was perfect, because at the end, when all the noise ends, the auditor comes and then starts very, very rightly so scrutinizing whether what we have done is a good use of public taxpayers' money. And I think we cooperate very well together. We are trying to take into account as much as possible your recommendations, but it is through working together with the member states, with the EIB, with the Court of Auditors, that we can at the end of the day deliver a good result. The fact that everybody seems to have a 5-principle list and they do not coincide, it shows how challenging the process is. I am very reassured by the fact that everybody seems to agree that simplification and flexibility should be 2 key elements of the next multi-annual financial framework, and we can start building the 3 Michelin star soup on that basis. But we are in the phases of preparing the broth to bring it out in May, and these kind of discussions are extremely helpful for the Commission. So unfortunately, we don't have time now for a round of questions from the floor, because we have to go back to the main room for the closing remarks. I would just give the opportunity for the speakers in case you want to add something else to what you said. No? Alexander?
Just very briefly, I think both from Matea and Migle and others, there was reference on how the EIB cooperates with development banks and others. The EIB, for instance, in Slovenia has an advisory in supporting the SID Banka to implement financial instruments in rural development, and then possibly also in urban development and other places. So what we try to do in the EIB is not only blend and so on, we also try to advise and pitch in and help in implementation.
Thank you very much. Well, on that positive note of the cooperation between European institutions and national promotional banks and national authorities implementing the EU budget, let me close this panel, and join me please in a warm round of applause for the excellent speakers we had today.